Ford Pinto. Just saying those two words out loud is enough to make most car enthusiasts either laugh, cringe, or walk out of the room entirely. And honestly, you can't really blame them. The Pinto has gone down in automotive history as one of the most embarrassing, most ridiculed, and most controversial cars that Ford, or really any American automaker, has ever put its name on. A car so notoriously bad that it became the punchline of every single joke about American engineering in the 1970s. But here's the thing. What if I told you that buried underneath all of that bad reputation, underneath all of the jokes and the memes and the exploding gas tank lawsuits, there was actually a version of the Ford Pinto that was so fast, so capable, and so well engineered that it was out there on racetracks across the country absolutely humiliating Porsches, not just keeping up with them, not just running alongside them, actually beating them, crossing the finish line first, and doing it consistently sounds crazy, right? Stick around, because this is the story of one of the most overlooked, most underappreciated, and most genuinely surprising performance cars that America has ever produced. This is the story of the Bob Negstad Pinto, the Pinto-based race cars of the SCCA, and the wild world of high-performance Pintos that most people have absolutely no idea ever existed. Welcome to Rare Cars. This is the channel where we dig deep into the world's most fascinating, most misunderstood, and most incredible performance vehicles and break down exactly what makes them so special and so unique. If you want to keep learning about cars like this one, hit that subscribe button right now because we have a lot more content coming your way very soon. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get into it. Let's talk about the car that nobody saw coming, the high-performance Ford Pinto. To really understand why the high-performance Pinto is such a wild and remarkable story, you first have to understand just how bad the standard Ford Pinto's reputation actually was. And we're not talking about a car that was just kind of mediocre or a little bit forgettable. We are talking about a car that became a genuine cultural disaster and a textbook case of corporate negligence that is still being taught in business ethics courses today. Ford introduced the Pinto in 1971 as their answer to the growing wave of small, fuel-efficient foreign cars that were flooding the American market at the time. The Volkswagen Beetle was everywhere. Japanese manufacturers were starting to make serious noise, and Ford needed something small, cheap, and quick to produce to compete. Lee Iacocca, who was running Ford at the time, famously insisted that the Pinto had to weigh under 2,000 pounds and cost under $2,000. That was the mandate. Build it fast, build it cheap, and get it to market, and they did exactly that. The Pinto went from a design concept to a production car in an impressively short time frame by automotive standards. But speed and cost cutting came with some very serious consequences, the most infamous of which was the fuel tank placement. On the standard Pinto, the fuel tank was positioned behind the rear axle, right up against the rear bumper. In a rear-end collision, even at relatively low speeds, The tank could be punctured by the differential housing bolts or crushed against the rear bumper, causing catastrophic fuel leaks and fires. Ford was aware of this issue. Internal documents, which later became public during lawsuits, showed that engineers had identified the problem and that the company had actually performed a cost-benefit analysis on fixing it. They calculated that the cost of modifying the fuel tank design was more expensive than the projected cost of settling lawsuits from fire-related deaths and injuries. The decision was made to leave the tank as it was. That memo and the story behind it became one of the most damning pieces of corporate evidence in American legal history and permanently destroyed the Pinto's reputation in the public eye. So that's the car we're talking about when we talk about the Pinto. A small, underpowered, scandal-ridden economy car that the American public grew to genuinely despise, which makes what happened on the racetrack all the more extraordinary. Here's the part of the story that most people don't know. Underneath all of the bad press and the economy car reputation, the Pinto actually had a mechanical foundation that, in the right hands, turned out to be genuinely usable for performance purposes. The standard production Pinto came with a range of engines depending on the year and the market. But the most interesting one from a performance standpoint was the 2.0-liter Lima 4-cylinder engine. Now, in stock form, this engine was nothing special. It pushed out somewhere in the range of 88 horsepower in its better configurations, which was barely enough to motivate a car that weighed just under 300 pounds in a way that could be called exciting. But the Lima engine had something that tuners and racers quickly noticed. It had good bones. It had a solid block, a decent cylinder head design, and it responded very well to modifications beyond the engine. The Pinto's basic architecture also worked in its favor in ways that weren't obvious from looking at the base car. It was small and lightweight by American standards. The front suspension setup, while nothing exotic, was workable. The overall proportions of the car gave it a low center of gravity compared to the larger American cars of the era. And crucially, the Pinto's bodywork was shared with the Mercury Bobcat, giving builders and tuners a slightly broader ecosystem of parts to work with. In the world of club racing, particularly in the Sports Car Club of America, which runs some of the most competitive amateur and semi-professional road racing in the United States, the rule book matters enormously. The SCCA groups cars into classes based on things like engine displacement, weight, and modifications allowed. And in the early to mid-1970s, when the Pinto started showing up in SCCA competition, it found itself in classes where its lightweight and the tunability of its 4-cylinder engine gave it a legitimate competitive advantage. Now, this is where the story gets really interesting, because while plenty of people were taking Pintos racing in club events and finding some success, there was one man whose work with the Pinto elevated the whole concept to a level that nobody had anticipated. That man was Bob Negstad. Bob Negstad was a Ford engineer, not a racing team from Europe, not a massive motorsports corporation with unlimited resources. A Ford engineer who happened to be deeply passionate about road racing and who saw something in the Pinto that virtually nobody else could see at the time. Negstad built what became known as one of the most formidable Pinto-based race cars in SCCA competition. Working within the rules of the class the car competed in, Negstad and the people around him transformed the Lima 4-cylinder engine into something genuinely remarkable. The engine received serious attention in the areas of cylinder head, porting and flow work, camshaft selection, carburation, and overall tuning. The result was a power plant that, in race-prepared form, was producing power outputs that were almost unrecognizable compared to what the same basic engine made sitting in a stock grocery getter Pinto in a dealership parking lot. But the engine was only part of the story. The suspension was reworked. The weight was reduced wherever the rulebook allowed. The chassis was carefully prepared. And when it all came together, what Negstad and his team had built was a Pinto that could go around a road racing circuit in a way that made drivers of much more exotic machinery take notice. And take notice they did. Because when the Negstad Pinto and cars built to similar specifications started competing against sports cars from Porsche in SCCA classes, the results were genuinely shocking. The little American economy car, the car that was the laughingstock of the automotive world, was running door-to-door with and outright beating machinery from one of the most respected sports car manufacturers on the planet. Think about what that means for a second. Porsche in the 1970s was building cars like the 914 and the 911. These were machines with serious engineering pedigree, serious racing heritage, and serious followings among enthusiasts who considered themselves the most discerning buyers in the market. The idea that a modified Pinto, a Pinto, could walk up to those cars on a racetrack and beat them was not just surprising. It was genuinely unbelievable to most people who witnessed it. Let's get into the details of what actually made these high-performance Pintos capable of doing what they did. Because the engineering story here is genuinely fascinating. The 2.0-liter Lima engine in race-prepared form benefited enormously from serious cylinder head work. The stock head flowed reasonably well for an economy engine. But when race builders got into it with porting and polishing tools, opened up the intake and exhaust passages, matched them to performance intake manifolds and headers, and paired all of that with aggressive camshaft profiles, the airflow characteristics of the engine changed dramatically. More air and fuel moving through the engine more efficiently meant significantly more power from the same displacement. Carburation was another major area. The stock Pinto ran a single barrel or two-barrel carburetor depending on the year and specification. Race versions moved to larger, more aggressive carburetor setups that could supply the engine with the fuel and air mixture it needed when the throttle was pinned and the revs were climbing. In some builds, Weber carburetors, the same type of carburation used on many European sports cars of the era, found their way onto Pinto engines, which is about as perfect a symbol of the whole story as you could ask for. Exhaust systems were carefully tuned for maximum scavenging effect. Headers were designed to take advantage of exhaust pulse timing to help pull spent gases out of the cylinders and assist in drawing fresh mixture in. On a highly tuned 4-cylinder engine running at race speeds, This kind of tuning can make a measurable difference in peak power output. The suspension modifications were equally important. Road racing is won and lost on cornering speed, not just straight line power. The Pinto's front suspension was modified with stiffer springs, adjustable dampers, and alignment settings dialed in for the specific demands of circuit racing. Sway bars were upgraded. In some builds, the rear axle setup received attention as well. The goal was to give the driver a car that could be placed with precision through fast corners, that communicated what the tires were doing through the steering wheel, and that remained stable and predictable at the limit. Weight reduction was pursued aggressively within the rules. The interior was stripped. Lighter components were sourced wherever possible. Because in a class where the rules restrict how much power you can extract from an engine, every pound you can remove from the car is essentially free performance. A lighter car accelerates harder, brakes shorter, and corners faster. The Pinto started with a relatively modest curb weight by American standards, and race-prepared versions got significantly lighter still. The combination of all of these factors, more power from the engine, better chassis dynamics, reduced weight, and properly tuned aerodynamics, produced a race car that was dramatically more capable than its road car origins would ever suggest. The SCCA racing results that the Pinto achieved during its competitive years were not flukes. This wasn't a situation where one car happened to have a good day and upset a faster field in unusual circumstances. The high-performance Pintos built by Negstad and by other serious competitors in the class were consistently fast, consistently competitive, and consistently capable of challenging and beating cars from manufacturers with far more illustrious motorsport pedigrees. In the showroom stock and prepared classes where Pinto-based cars competed, they developed a genuine reputation. Other competitors knew that when a properly built Pinto showed up at a regional or national SCCA event, it was not going to be a pushover. The car earned respect on the merits of its on-track performance, which is the only currency that matters in racing. The broader impact of the Pinto's racing success was felt in a few different ways. First, it demonstrated that the Lima engine platform, despite its economy car origins, had real potential in the right hands. That knowledge influenced how tuners and builders thought about Ford's four-cylinder engines going forward. Second, it proved once again the fundamental truth of racing that has been demonstrated countless times throughout the history of motorsport, that the driver, the setup, and the preparation matter enormously, sometimes more than the prestige of the badge on the hood. Beyond the pure racing context, there was also a small but dedicated community of street performance Pinto enthusiasts who drew inspiration from the racing successes and applied some of the same principles to cars that would see actual road use. Modified street Pintos with improved engines and suspension never got the mainstream attention that muscle cars of the same era enjoyed. But within the community of people who knew what these cars could do, they were taken seriously. So if the high-performance Pinto was genuinely fast and genuinely capable of beating Porsches on a racetrack, why doesn't anyone talk about it? Why is the Pinto's performance legacy completely absent from mainstream automotive culture? The answer comes back to where we started. The fuel tank scandal was simply too big, too damaging, and too thoroughly covered by the media for anything positive about the Pinto to survive in the public consciousness. By the time the lawsuits and the magazine exposés and the television coverage had finished with the Pinto's reputation, the car was so thoroughly toxic in the minds of American consumers that no amount of racetrack success was going to rehabilitate it. The Pinto stopped production in 1980, and when it died, it took its racing history with it into obscurity. There's also the matter of what the Pinto was competing against. Porsche may have been beaten on the racetrack by Pintos, but the public's perception of Porsche and the public's perception of the Pinto were so different, so completely separated by brand image and cultural association, that the idea of a Pinto beating a Porsche seemed more like a joke than a legitimate automotive achievement. And frankly, the people who built and raced these cars were club racers, engineers, and enthusiasts, not marketing departments. Nobody was out there building a narrative around the performance Pinto, crafting stories for magazines, or lobbying for coverage. The people involved just cared about going fast. And that right there is the abridged story of the high-performance Ford Pinto, a car that the world decided it hated before anyone had a chance to see what it was actually capable of. A car that, in the right hands, with the right preparation and the right engineering, went out onto racetracks across America and proved that it could run with and beat some of the most respected sports cars in the world. The Pinto will probably never get fully rehabilitated in the court of public opinion. The fuel tank story is too well known. The jokes are too deeply embedded in the culture. But for the people who were there, for the people who built these cars and drove them and watched them win, the high-performance Pinto is something worth remembering. It's a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely cars in the most unlikely places can do things that nobody expected. If you enjoyed this video, we would genuinely appreciate it if you could drop a like down below and share this with any other enthusiasts you think would find this story as wild as we do. Make sure you are subscribed to the Rare Cars YouTube channel and absolutely smash that notification bell so you don't miss any of the documentary-style content we have coming. Until next time, enthusiasts.